Hello everyone. My name is Dr. Wyatt Hall. I'm an assistant professor of public health sciences at the University of Rochester Medical Center. I focus on research regarding the public health perspective on concerns related to early childhood language acquisition for deaf children. I also work for Gallaudet University at the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Child Resilience Center. There we also focus on language deprivation. Before I proceed with this presentation, I want to explain a bit of my background and upbringing because that had great influence on how in which I arrived to the work I currently do in prioritizing that concern for the deaf community. I grew up in a mainstream program. I was in a total communication program, meaning that there was both sign language and spoken language, along with amplification and an FM system. Growing up, I was functioning on grade level. There was a deaf education self-contained classroom, and I would go out into the hearing classroom for certain classes and socialize with my hearing peers. My mainstream program was fairly large, about 30 students. Many of them remained in the self-contained classroom. Once I got to middle school, I recognized that whereas I was going out into the mainstream classroom, many of my peers remained in the self-contained classroom. They had lower math skills. They were on an elementary level. They were still reading children's books. That really bothered me. I had advanced reading and writing skills, I was making progress in math and science, and yet they were falling further behind. I was already reflecting upon this disparity in middle school. High school was even worse. I observed my peers lagging even further behind. Upon graduation, I went to Rochester Institute of Technology. I already had an interest in psychological development, reading skills, and what I had witnessed in my own education. I went to graduate school at Gallaudet University, where I got my PhD in clinical psychology. There I began my training in assessment, mental health counseling, and deaf community members began coming to me for services. I started to notice a pattern amongst the clients I served. Oftentimes, they had had poor access to language growing up. Their day-to-day functioning and everyday life was tough. They really struggled and needed quite a bit of support. Once I completed my PhD, I did my postdoctoral studies at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. In that area, there was an inpatient mental health hospital with a deaf unit. And while working there, what I saw was terrible. Several patients had a complete access of language growing up, and many of them ended up institutionalized. That had a huge impact on me. And around the same time, the community began discussions around language deprivation. Sanjay Gulati, who's a well-known psychiatrist, gave a presentation talking about his 30 years of experience and the need to prioritize the issues around language deprivation. It was almost like a light bulb went off for me. When I recognized what I had already witnessed in my own upbringing, what I had seen throughout my personal experiences with my friends and peers falling further behind in school, as well as my professional experience with community members coming to see me for services, I recognized that language deprivation could have been the underlying cause for a lot of what I had been seeing. And so at that time, I decided to redirect my focus to research, and I've been very fortunate to work in the University of Rochester system and to continue to grow the body of research, publications, and raising awareness around this issue. So this is one of those efforts. I hope that while watching, you're able to learn more about the information we're trying to disseminate to the community. First of all, you have to understand that first language learning is both biological and experience-driven. This means that when we are born, our brain has been biologically preparing and growing during gestation. Upon birth, it is now ready for acquiring skills within the environment. The brain begins learning based on everyday experiences, which impact how the brain develops. The same is true for language. Upon birth, the brain is primed to learn language, assuming it has access to language. What we've seen in research and scientific studies is that there appears to be a window for this to occur, a time in which the brain is really primed to learn language. After a certain age 3, 4, 5, even 6, there's no specific age, but it is obvious that it occurs in the early years, that upon closure of that window, the brain is ready to move on to other normal developmental milestones. Once it goes through that language sequence in early childhood, it then moves on to the next sequence of developmental milestones. As a neurocritical window for language acquisition comes to a close and has not yet established a strong language foundation, there will be many struggles down the road. Many individuals that we see that do not have a healthy language foundation prior to the closure of that window appear different from those who have a healthy language foundation from birth. So that's where it's important to understand both the biological and experience-driven aspects of the critical window. People agree about the need to provide language as soon as possible. However, many people disagree how in which that occurs, but people do agree that language exposure needs to occur prior to the closure of that window. I want to take a moment for you to read through this. There are a few things on this slide that I want to emphasize. There's the title itself, which says Uncontroversial Facts. I intentionally put that on the slide because, generally speaking, American Sign Language and other signed languages are accepted as languages. Linguistic studies, psychological studies, cognitive imaging. This is uncontroversial. Sign language is part of the human experience and understanding how language function impacts development. The only field in which we see sign language remaining controversial is within deaf education, which tells us that the field of deaf education is behind others. They've already moved on. These are facts. There are no citations listed because these are commonly accepted uncontroversial facts about sign languages. There's no need to defend the legitimacy of American Sign Language or other sign languages. This is an accepted fact. Another thing is that the brain does not discriminate between spoken language and sign languages. Brain imaging shows that the language centers of the brain light up in the same manner regardless of the language input. The language center, the language function of the brain will light up. Yes, there are different areas for visual and auditory input that light up on brain imaging as well. But again, the brain does not discriminate between modality. It just wants access to language. It's almost like food. Language is food for the brain. It is nutrition for the brain. The brain doesn't care how it gets it. It just wants access to it. So, knowing that the brain does not discriminate against language, it's important to understand that language impacts every part of daily life. If you take a moment now to consider your day-to-day goings-on, is there any moment in which you do not use language? No. We use language for everything, for learning, for social interaction, for thinking, for writing. There is nothing in which language does not impact, which means that language is a foundational part of what makes us human. It helps us grow as humans. It impacts everything we do. As you can see here in this slide, it touches everything in some way. So when we have good access to language, a positive, healthy foundation allows us to grow into our full self. The way in which the areas of our lives are impacted that benefit from a positive language foundation are therefore harmed when there's a lack of language. Areas in which we would see growth with healthy language development, we see deficits with unhealthy language development. It hurts development, cognition, it hurts social interactions, and a myriad of other areas. And that's why we have such a huge concern in regards to this. We want deaf children to have good access to language. So I briefly reviewed these. They're uncontroversial facts. We can all agree that early language exposure, language immersion, use of language is critical for language acquisition and brain development. Secondly, the brain does not discriminate against sign languages or spoken languages. They are languages that reap the same benefits. That being said, how many deaf children receive early access to sign language when they do not have good access to spoken language? Hearing aids, cochlear implants, they allow for better access, but it does not mean they get ideal access. It doesn't put them on equal footing of a hearing child. So do those children have access to sign language? To the best of our knowledge, not many. The United States seems to be less than 10%. Worldwide, we're only looking at 1 or 2%. We recognize that many children have questionable access to spoken language. They may have amplification, but without access to sign language, that has a resounding impact. Which is why we frame it as a public health crisis. Deaf children have language access that is mediocre at best, which has lifelong repercussions. That is a public health crisis. Of course, we have to step back and recognize that most parents of deaf children are hearing. For the majority of these parents, the first deaf person they meet is their own child, and that means they need support, learning about what they need to prioritize, including language. And so, when you consider the landscape out there, knowing that most deaf children have hearing parents, and there is a concern about them not necessarily getting good access to language, what does that look like? This study is from a nationwide survey that was conducted. They went door to door, taking a census of those who live there and their health needs in order to create a snapshot of the health of the nation, so to speak. And one of the questions was in regards to hearing loss. Do you have any children with a hearing loss? So we took the opportunity to assess this data in finding out what parents were told to be concerned about in regards to their deaf children versus their hearing children and their development. So it seems that parents with children that had a hearing loss are 11 times more likely to be told that their child would experience a developmental delay and not hitting their developmental milestones, more difficulty with emotional regulation, attention, behavior, getting along with others, distractibility, having suspicions of autism or Asperger's, more likely to not be well behaved or do what others tell them to do. But keep in mind that when deaf children and hearing children are born, their brain is primed in the same way, assuming there are no additional issues at birth. So why is it that deaf children are expected to have a litany of issues? Clearly, there must be a divergence in their respective developmental paths. Without definitive evidence, I would still posit that language impacts all of these areas. Language could be a contributing factor in observations about developmental delays. Language is important for emotional control, focus, for regulating behavior, getting along with others. Language is important for attention, sitting still, and recognizing that the teacher is watching and therefore I should be paying attention in class. Language is critical for your inner voice. Language is crucial for social interactions. An outsider looking in may assume the cause is autism or Asperger's. Obviously, you need to have access to the language around you in order to do what is asked of you and to be well behaved. there's clearly an undercurrent of something else at play. Generally speaking, public health studies over the course of the last 25 years have raised concerns about adverse childhood experiences, commonly known as ACEs. In looking at the hearing population, trauma during childhood seems to contribute to worsened adult health outcomes, a worsened quality of life. ACEs can include serious abuse, witnessing domestic violence in the home, witnessing drug use in the home. It could be growing up in a home of divorce. It could be having an incarcerated family member. All of these seem to have a lifelong impact. ACEs have a high correlation to cancer, diabetes, heart issues, mental health needs, worse employment outcomes, and worse educational outcomes. They can have a real negative impact on adult life outcomes. This research was conducted over the course of 25 years. So what does ACEs look like for deaf individuals? We posed that question. Deaf children become deaf adults, but they grew up in a very unique context. Understanding how language and other concerns impact them, the type of school they go to, getting a cochlear implant, hearing aid, social interaction with peers, we decided to conduct a survey of 500 deaf individuals and collecting some demographic information about their upbringing, including their age, gender, race, etc. Plus, we include questions about schooling. Did they go to a deaf school? Did they go to a mainstream school? Did they go to an oral school? And some other factors unique to the deaf community. We looked at those with 2 or more ACEs and those with 4 or more ACEs, because one study that shows that 2 or more ACEs contributes to an increase in the mental health needs for deaf adults, and 4 or more ACEs in the general hearing population shows they're at high risk for serious health outcomes in adulthood. So 3 findings contribute to an increased likelihood of experiencing either 2 or more or 4 or more ACEs. One was being hard of hearing. Having a mild to moderate hearing loss seemed to have a correlation to 2 or more ACEs or 4 or more ACEs, which puts them at risk. Secondly, not attending a school with sign language access. I want to clarify that signing access is defined very broadly. It ranges from having an interpreter in the mainstream school all the way to being fully immersed in a signing environment at the school for the deaf. The third was having a cochlear implant. So you may be sitting there watching this thinking, wow, this is serious. Yes, all 3 of these factors are serious. Hard of hearing children could give the appearance of being hearing, could give the appearance of picking up spoken language. However, they are still missing quite a bit, which can lead to stressors and communication breakdowns in the family home. Also, not attending a school with sign language access. We know that sign language provides access to peers, and having visual language is critical for children, and not having access to that could lead to additional stressors within the environment that can lend itself to trauma. Third, cochlear implants. I want to clarify, cochlear implants are a tool. A cochlear implant in and of itself does not necessarily hurt or help anyone, but how you choose to use the tool is what causes the impact. So for those with cochlear implants, we oftentimes focus on deaf children acquiring listening and spoken language with a cochlear implant. But what does that cochlear implant mean for the family? What does it mean for family dynamics, parent expectations, the child's expectations? What is the emotional impact of having the surgery to insert the cochlear implant? We really need to unpack that further, because implants in and of itself, I'm not against them, but we need to have those dialogues beyond just listening and spoken language outcomes, but what is really happening and what is the impact on the child and the family when they decide to proceed with a cochlear implant? Are they receiving enough support? Do they have reasonable expectations? So, when that popped up in the study, we wanted to make sure it is not the tool that increases the risk of trauma. Also, there is one deaf researcher by the name of Poorna Kushal-Nagar, who's from Gallaudet University, that posited the concept of adverse childhood communication experiences. They have found that having poor direct communication with the family every day, as well as poor access to indirect communication within the environment, contributes to deaf adults having worsened outcomes for health. This includes diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, lung disease, and mental health needs. So we need to start thinking about what these experiences mean during childhood. When parents or early childhood intervention makes choices that impacts the child, not just in the area of language acquisition, but also social emotional development, physical health, the impacts of adult health outcomes, and how deaf adults are still being impacted by those choices made in early years. So all of this, to be said, is based on deaf adults reflecting on their childhood. This is also some of what I saw when doing my postdoc at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center in the inpatient unit. There is one well-known psychologist by the name of Neil Glickman that happened to be running a deaf mental health unit in Massachusetts for a long time. He noted a similar pattern to what I had been seeing and conducted an analysis as to why deaf patients were institutionalized versus hearing patients. Most hearing patients were institutionalized due to psychosis and mental illness. The finding was that only 28% of deaf individuals were institutionalized for psychosis. However, it was also found that over 75% of deaf individuals were also language disfluent, meaning they do not have fluency in a first language, which means that many of the deaf individuals who were institutionalized were not there for reasons of mental illness or psychosis, but for reasons related to language, meaning that they lacked language access to the point in which it impacted their everyday functioning and their ability to develop and function in their daily lives. It could have resulted in incidents with the law, an inability to live independently, reaching a point where the system did not know what to do with those individuals and therefore they were placed in a hospital. This is horrific, which means that the mental health system is seeing the consequence of deaf children not having healthy access to language. It is at the point where deaf professionals within the mental health field have begun that discussion in regards to language deprivation syndrome. As I mentioned, deaf professionals in mental health have been dialoguing about language deprivation syndrome. That concept has not yet been published in the DSM or psychological circles. We're still having these discussions in regards to it. A lot more research needs to be done to affirm its existence, but clinical experts do recognize its presence. Language deprivation syndrome includes the following: a lack of access to language, a lack of language fluency in a first language, fund of knowledge gaps, and what that means is a lack of understanding of how the world around them functions, is to the point in which they do not know appropriate behavior, how to interact with others. They don't know anything about the legal system or laws. They cannot testify in a trial, as well as having disruptions to thinking, mood, and or behavior that is clinically significant to where it impacts their everyday functioning, sometimes to the point in which they're a danger to themselves or others. And exclusion, meaning it's not best explained by another mental health disorder. So all of these here lie within our discussions, and what we have seen in practice has come to light. However, a lot more research needs to happen before this can be disseminated within the DSM or other publications. So yes, many of us know that historically speaking, sign language use has been marginalized. There has been an oppression of the deaf community. But there are three common arguments that I see about not giving sign language access to deaf children, and I'll expand upon each one of them. The first is that you have to prioritize spoken language first, and that deaf children can learn sign language later. That first, it should be listening and spoken language prioritized. This quote is from several years ago. The A.G. Bell Association president had published a statement saying that the window for a deaf child to acquire listening and spoken language was far shorter compared to the window to acquire American Sign Language. So she was saying that you need to prioritize that because there's a shorter window for that auditory modality, whereas the visual modality has a broader window. So you can just use sign language as a backup plan. I'll show you an image of what they're stating. So that neurocritical period, based on A.G. Bell's president past statement, what they're saying is that there's actually two windows of language acquisition. The first window being for that of an auditory modality, and the second being for a visual modality. Basically saying that there are two critical periods based on the visual modality and auditory modality. Except, we already have research that shows no, deaf people do not acquire spoken language and then learn sign language later. They do not have the same type of proficiency as those who acquire sign language during that early critical period. One example is displayed in that slide there. That graph was based on a brain imaging study that was done with different groups of deaf adults, all who had been using sign language for over 30 years and had never acquired spoken language. They were grouped based on age of sign language acquisition. So they watched ASL videos, and then they were tested for their reaction time for the brain to process the language. So they watched the video, then they would click their button, and the slope on the graph shows the speed of their reaction time. So if you look at that, the y-axis shows how quickly they responded for native signers and those with early language exposure. Their response time was much quicker when watching the sign language videos, whereas the x-axis showed that adults, the older they were when they were exposed, had a slower reaction time. And as I mentioned, all of these individuals had already been signing over 30 years. So even after 30 years of using sign language, the brain still displayed differences in their language fluency. Now, I am not a neurologist. I did not conduct this testing. I'm just explaining that language experience has an impact on the brain structure, how the brain forms and develops. So if you see in the upper left versus the bottom right, we also see where the brain is lighting up differently. There is blue and orange lighting up on the images. So the blue means we gave sign language access to native signers to see how the brain lit up. That is for their use of ASL. Whereas the orange is for someone who was exposed to sign language after the age of 20. Prior to that, they had no access to language. And so the orange lights up the brain differently compared to the native signers. This ties into a concept you might be familiar with, neuroplasticity. And that has to do with the brain's ability to adapt. And as you become older, the brain becomes less plastic and more rigid in its functioning. It develops in an area and then moves on to the next sequence of development. So that means that as the brain becomes older, it becomes more rigid in its ability to learn language. The brain doesn't have those typical language areas available for it to do that, and it's not as efficient. And therefore, the language developed is not as healthy compared to someone who's exposed to language much earlier in life. The point being that there are not two distinct windows of language development based on modality. There was one neurocritical period regardless of modality, and after that window closes, language development is severely stunted. ASL is not a backup plan. The second argument I commonly see is all children with cochlear implants can hear and speak well. The National Institute of Health, NIDOC, the National Institute on Deafness and Other Communication Disorders, has this quote posted on their website, saying eligible children who receive a cochlear implant before 18 months of age will develop language skills at a rate comparable to children with normal hearing. As you can see here from this graph, there was a study that measured the listening and spoken language skills for deaf children. If you see the black line distribution, that's for hearing children, whereas the yellow distribution lines are for deaf children with cochlear implants based on their comprehension. So in my presentations, I oftentimes will ask the audience, what's the first thing you notice? The most common responses is that they see a wider distribution or spread within the deaf children, whereas the hearing children have a much more narrow trajectory. So if you notice, some of those yellow lines are completely flat, which means they have no comprehension of spoken language whatsoever. Now, the study did not report whether or not they were signers or non-signers, but I would guess that they are non-signers. Each line on the graph represents a single child. This is looking at children in their day-to-day functioning. If they do not have ideal access to listening and spoken language, their comprehension suffers. Keep in mind that this graph is for those who received an implant under the age of 18 months. So that image I just showed you with the yellow lines, that's the best performing group within this study, but they still do not come close to mirroring that of their hearing peers. The top set of graphs are measuring comprehension, and the bottom ones are measuring their speech intelligibility. So the yellow is for those implanted before 18 months of age, the blue is implantation between 18 to 36 months, and the green is implantation after the age of 36 months. You may notice that at the 36 months you see a significantly varied distribution. The blue is a little bit narrower, the yellow is even more narrow, but still the yellow, which is before 18 months, still does not come close to mirroring that of their hearing peers. There's quite a bit of variability. And so parents are taking a gamble. Will they develop spoken language or not? Because for many deaf children, it does not seem that they have a healthy development based on listening and spoken language, nor full access to language. So I've dispelled that myth. The third common argument is that if you learn a sign language, it will interfere with spoken language development. So most deaf children with a cochlear implant do not have access to sign language. But what happens to those that do? There are some that come from families where they choose to both sign and receive a cochlear implant. There was one researcher that wanted to look at those groups. So they looked at one group that were deaf children of deaf families with sign language exposure, one that was deaf children with hearing families with no sign language exposure, and investigating cochlear implant outcomes. So they wanted to see how clear their speech was, how well their listening comprehension was, and how well they were generally able to hear with the implant. So the hypothesis, generally speaking, was that sign language would interfere with it, making the assumption that deaf children with hearing parents would actually do better than those deaf children from deaf families with a cochlear implant. In fact, the opposite was true. If you look at the red lines within these graphs, these were deaf children with signing deaf families that had a cochlear implant versus the blue line, which were deaf children with cochlear implants from hearing families with no sign access. Ironically, we're seeing the deaf children of deaf families with sign access performing better with their cochlear implants versus the deaf children with no sign access and hearing parents. So this showed the sign language might actually help or support cochlear implant outcomes. There was another research group that considered deaf children of deaf families with a cochlear implant are bilingual and bimodal, meaning they are picking up the English, an auditory modality, as well as sign language, a visual modality. They needed to compare them to another group of people that were also bilingual and bimodal. So when I asked this to a group, of course, they immediately respond, CODA, or child of deaf adult. So they are hearing English, they grow up listening to English, spoken language, and then they use sign language with their deaf parents. So let's just put this out there. Are we concerned about CODA's language acquisition, their functioning, their abilities? No. They oftentimes become interpreters. They go into the world, they function just fine. We have no concern about CODAs. But within this research, they had a very small pool of subjects looking at deaf children from deaf families with cochlear implants using sign language, as well as their hearing siblings, because they are within the same language environment, hearing spoken language and having sign language access. So they gave them a litany of tests, including literacy skills, listening and spoken language skills, sign language skills, and others. The finding was that there was no difference. So deaf children of deaf families with cochlear implants that had sign language performed no differently from their CODA siblings. You have to remember, there are no concerns about CODAs. So what that means is that sign language may in fact support cochlear implants. So when we think about the early years, it makes sense. If and when we are born, we receive access to language, we learn, the brain begins to map an understanding of how to function within the world. Whereas with deaf children, we often say, oh, hold on, don't sign. Let's get a cochlear implant first. Does the brain know what to do with a cochlear implant? No. They have to wait maybe 1 or 2 years and they're not given convenient or easy access to language, and then it delays them further. And then they have to learn how to use the implant. And maybe by then they're 3, 4, even 5 by the time they do that. But if you're providing sign access since birth and then they get an implant, you then have already had access to a language foundation to help you learn and use the implant. For example, let's imagine that I'm seated and I have a cochlear implant and I hear a bird tweeting within my environment. However, I don't know yet what that sound means. There's just a sound in my environment. But if I have sign language, I may see that a bird is doing something and then someone can communicate to me, hey, that bird, that sound you're hearing is the bird tweeting. So now I have a concept interplaying with the sound that I'm hearing, and therefore in the future when I hear that tweet, I recognize that it's coming from the bird and my brain is able to connect those two concepts together. But if I don't have access to sign language and I don't have good access to spoken language, all I have is someone looking at me and exaggeratedly saying, that's a bird. It doesn't mean that I'm able to understand the spoken language around me, and therefore it makes it even more difficult for me to connect language with concepts. So having sign language would support a quicker acquisition of language with cochlear implant usage. That makes sense. Based on these two bodies of research, sign language may actually support growth with cochlear implants. It's ironic. We have dismantled those 3 common arguments I just shared with you. They have been debunked. Science shows more and more that sign language is good and sign language is helpful. So really, what it all boils down to is when we look at history, when we look at concerns regarding educational systems and development, hearing society at large is concerned about things like we need to make sure they can communicate. They need to be able to speak. They need to be able to interact with their hearing family members. They prioritize communication before really considering cognition, which is developing their thinking skills, considering how the brain develops. And really, that's a reverse priority. What should be prioritized? Parental concern about how my child will communicate and speak should be replaced with, how will my child think? How will my child learn? How will my child have access to the world around them and the concepts in the world? So prioritizing cognition before communication. By prioritizing cognition, communication will happen because you have to be able to understand the world. You have to be able to understand people and understand how early access to language helps the brain develop in order to communicate versus focusing solely on spoken language. Because if you don't have ideal language access, the brain becomes rigid and cognition becomes harder. The point is that yes, language deprivation is 100% preventable. It is not something that is a guaranteed occurrence for deaf children. It is a social phenomenon that is tied to some historical contention regarding what to do with deaf children's language development. Keep in mind, I am not against implants. I'm not against spoken language acquisition. I'm not against anything. I am against the withholding of sign language from deaf children. Give them sign language. Give them an implant. Give them language. Give them everything. And the deaf child will figure out what is best for themselves, giving them all of these things. And then maybe one day they may choose to sign with their deaf friends. The next day they may choose to use their cochlear implant to use spoken language with their hearing family. The more they have, the more they're able to easily navigate their life. However, if they are limited within those early years, it is harder for them to broaden those abilities down the road. So all that being said, thank you for your time. I hope you've learned something, and I hope you've gained a better understanding about the importance of early language acquisition for deaf and hard of hearing children. We cannot delay language exposure. Give them full access to language, not mediocre access, not no access, but full access. Thank you.